And then I read a great article from Yussef about it. And essentially what's happening here is that Fortnite has basically taken motion capture data from the Millie Rock in this case, and they have applied it to characters within the game. And from there, they also sell the movements for, I think, $10 a movement, and then they erase the name of the movement as well. So they change the name, they basically erase the cultural significance of these dances. And so from there, that got me thinking how I could potentially turn this library into a space where I wasn't only just creating a tool that people can use with diverse movements, but that I could create that would allow people to, that would allow myself and others to protect and to preserve movements in our community. That's it. Yeah, so then that's when all of these questions started to arise. The first one being, how do we combat the exploitation, the erasure, and the dilution of Black culture? So in those first two examples, we see that when the movements are free, then they're not the actual movements. But when there's a way to compensate from the movements, then all of a sudden we know what hip-hop dancing is. So that in itself is just, it's wrong. But then, how can we build spaces where our stories are safe, heard, and where they're also celebrated? So one of the things that really helped me and motivated me to start this project was the idea that I was not only categorizing movements, but I was categorizing the stories that come with them. So making sure that I am really creating this library that is talking about the person wholly. In previous motion capture databases, the movements are separated from the mover in that they don't tell you who's creating the movements, and they don't tell you, you know, they'll tell you where the movements happened, like what motion capture studio it was done in, but they won't tell you exactly who's in the motion capture suit, and they won't tell you the story of that person. And I find that extremely problematic, especially for me creating Black characters in my experiences, mainly because it sort of creates this sort of weird line of digital blackface and making sure that I'm not doing that when I am creating my experiences. So the Black Movement Project expanded from just a digital tool into a library. And it's a library for activists, artists, and performers to create diverse extended reality projects. It's a space of research for how and why we move, and it's also an archive of our existence. And this database is also, in project, is also really inspired by Catherine Dunham's movement library. So Catherine Dunham was a dancer, an anthropologist, a teacher, and so many more things. And essentially, she did a lot of anthropology work, traveling throughout the Caribbean, 2 different communities, and taking video, as well as writing extensively about different cultures and how they moved in spaces. And that's pretty much what I'm doing, but just in a 3D, in 3D environments. And another really cool thing about Catherine Dunham's library is that it informed a lot of her performances, and she created the Dunham technique, and which transformed the world of modern dance. And and so that said, I realized that I could expand this library more to be more than a tool, but also performances, workshops, conversations like today, and as well as tool making. So that said, I'm trying to build a community where we're all coming together, we're looking at these tools, we're breaking them down, and we're creating spaces to make better tools, to challenge spaces, and yeah. So it incorporates a narrative component to be seen as both a live performance and a virtual reality docuseries. And that said, basically, I've been working with different performance artists, and I've been doing interviews with them, learning about their movement journeys, and with those recordings, creating performances that integrate the interviews when you go to see them. And so for this first one, I was using the perception neuron, which is a type of motion capture suit. And I was also using Unreal Engine, and I was able to take data from the two performers, Nala Duma and Ronaldo Maurice, and create visuals in real time. And here's a video of the night when that happened. Oops. From there, I've been taking this data and I've been working to translate it into a virtual reality experience as well, so that people can basically look at the data from different mediums and in different ways. But then after that, I realized midway through being here that I was focusing on so many other performers, but I really needed to take time to do the same work for myself. And I realized that I needed to take some steps to redefine my own movement practice and my own movement journey. And I grew up figure skating, which is a predominantly white sport. And it affected me in a lot of different ways, both positive and negative. And one of the things that I had realized on my particular movement journey was that I really needed to take the time to sort of process and, I guess, decolonize my relationship to the ice and try to understand what that meant. So I went to Minneapolis for a month, and I skated with an all African-American skating group called Brown Body, which is led by Damien Richburg, and we basically did this work together. We talked a lot about race and what it meant to basically be Black in a space that's not built for us. And we really tried to work to redefine our relationship to the ice, and we really did a lot of work to learn more about history and the history of movement. So in this performance, we actually did ring shout, on the ice. So that was really interesting. And ring shout is a early form of social dance from African Americans, and essentially it's a way to connect with one another through shuffling around in a circle. And through that shuffling, we are able to basically, I don't know, for me, I've been actually thinking a lot about ring shout as a way of like time travel, but that's another story. But through ring shout, we're able to connect to one another, and we basically shuffled around an ancestor altar. And so I brought pictures of my ancestors, and I was able to connect with them while I was on the ice, which was a really magical experience for me. Yeah, and then also, from there, I developed a workshop series called Understanding, Transforming, Preserving Movement, Black Movement in Digital Spaces. And so what happens within those workshops is that people come in, and we basically go through the process of learning about all of these different tools. In this case, we learn about 2 separate motion capture systems. One is called the notch, and then the other one is the perception neuron. And then we go through the process of adding that motion capture data to characters that we build using McMillian and DAZ. And then we take those characters and place them into Unreal Engine. And what's really interesting about this workshop is that we're not only going through the process of creating this motion capture data and characters, we're actually questioning the tools and trying to have discussions around deconstructing tools as we move along. For instance, actually you can even see in this picture that character is one form of a base model. And what you'll see in a lot of these different programs is that the base model is mostly always white, able-bodied, and thin, and gendered, and that also within these programs, you're left with sliders that are supposed to represent different races. So they'll have a slider for African, or they'll have a slider for Asian, or they'll have they'll reduce, all of these diverse, all of our bodies into sliders. And it really makes you stop and think about who is behind building these tools in the first place. Because if you think that you can create just one slider for African, then you're dead wrong. So But then that also brings me to the other part of this, which is the conversations. And today we have Aimee, Meredith Cox, and Yussef, and they're really amazing, and I'm so excited that they're here to talk. The whole purpose of these conversations is Yussef has a background in animation and writing. Aimee Meredith Cox is a dancer, anthropologist, as well as a professor from Yale. And what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to bridge these conversations with people from 2 separate fields who may not have had a conversation like this before, to begin to create a space where it's not just solely technical or solely performative, but it's actually equal in what we're trying to do. Because the project itself is a lot of different things going on at the same time. So, yeah. Come on up.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was incredible.
Thanks. Yes, so let's just start by both of you just talking about your practice and a little bit about your history, and yeah.
I guess I'll start. So you already did a wonderful job introducing me. I work in animation and I also write as a freelancer, and most of my animation work is for television and commercials, and I work with After Effects a lot and work in graphic design focused areas. Currently, I'm working on Patriot Act with Hassan Minhaj on Netflix. I'm the lead designer there, and it's a really cool show. You should watch it. And yeah, but also I wear a totally different hat, and I write about video games online primarily, some other media, but mainly video games. And a lot of my writing is aimed at trying to bridge the gap of something that's very siloed away and very niche, and bringing in more real world concerns and critical concerns, and how they affect me as a person of color, and how they have a historic lineage, and just kind of like a general media criticism angle on them. So Fortnite was one of the articles that I wrote about, which I could talk about later. And I've also written about, which is also great, I wrote about like lighting dark skin in games and the technology that goes into that and why it's currently failing. And other subjects. I wrote about this game called Cuphead, which is it's based around Fleischer animation from the 30s. It's a super popular game that essentially skated around the issue of that animation period being extremely racist, and having minstrel roots and being based in vaudeville and minstrelsy, and they kind of just avoided it. So I was like, wait, let's talk about it, and made probably some people mad. So I've written about that and a bunch of other things, and I hope I continue finding cool subjects to cover. And I think this talk is super inspirational for me, and I'm happy you brought me here.
I'm just so thrilled to be a part of this conversation. We had a phone call last week, and I was just like, tell me everything. I don't know what you're talking about. I have no idea. What do you mean? What is, I had my sort of entry into this conversation is really through dance and movement and ethnography and anthropology. And so just in that like half-hour conversation, Yussef and LaJuné opened up this whole new world and understanding of how I have, in a very broad sense in my work, been thinking about the relationship between bodies and space. So in a very like basic way, that's what I'm concerned with. How do we understand spatiality and corporality, and how we can transform these spaces that are largely meant to transform us. And when I say spaces, I mean geographic spaces, institutional spaces, ideological spaces. And in my first book, Shapeshifters, Black Girls and the Choreography of Citizenship, I looked at how a group of young women in Detroit, Michigan, living in a homeless shelter, but also very much living in Detroit and beyond that shelter, transform these various institutional and geographic sites that are meant to work on them and transform them and shape them into certain types of citizens. And at that time, I had entered graduate school, having just left dancing with Aimee too, and talking about entering white spaces, and was very much determined not to have my dance background be a part of what my scholarship was going to focus on, because at that time, and this is in the late 90s, performance studies was a very exciting thing, but not yet what it is right now. And so I was being pushed to write about Aimee and write about dance, and in my mind, focusing on the body as a Black woman in a very white anthropology program, I felt like would undermine my credibility, which, that's a whole other conversation. But so I was avoiding thinking about the body in that way and avoiding thinking about dance. But when I started my field work in the shelter in Detroit, those young women I had no choice but to think about the body and think about movement. And these were young women who were not trained as dancers, but who were using their bodies which were the sites of transformation, their bodies which were sites of state surveillance in so many ways, their bodies which were seen as the problem in the shelter and beyond the shelter. They were using that site of vulnerability and precarity as a way to resist. And so these young women were dancing in the shelter and using poetry and movement as a way to talk about what they were going through. So it became a very like self-healing collective space. But then they took this project to the streets of Detroit and were performing in the streets of Detroit as a way to create a spectacle, first of all, and as a way to get Detroit residents to come watch this spectacle and then have conversations about some of the things that were happening in the city. So for these young women, I mean, if you can just imagine this, you're 17 and you're homeless, you have 2 kids, and you're thinking about how you can use your body as a site of transformation in the city, right? I mean, it's just unbelievable to me that that kind of, your body, which in so many ways is being labeled as a site of the problematic site, and that you want to choose to put yourself in the dangerous situation of being in these very streets that you're unprotected in, and talk about how we can transform the city that doesn't protect you. I mean, to me, it's mind-blowing. But so dance became a part of that project, and movement and thinking about space and bodies became a part of that first ethnographic project. And I started to think about all of these ways that we don't understand the power of our bodies and the power of embodiment, and was starting to trouble the distinction between dance versus movement versus embodiment and what that might mean in my work. And so currently, I'm working on a project called Living Past Slow Death, which is looking at the idea of what does it mean to get free. You know, we talk a lot about getting free and Black liberation, but what does it really, really, really mean to Black people in 3 cities? I'm looking at Cincinnati, Ohio, Jackson, Mississippi, and Clarksburg, West Virginia. And in the first beginning of this research project in Cincinnati, I was telling LaJuné and Yussef that these interviews with Black women activists are so viscerally arresting that they were almost demanding to be translated through the body. And so I returned to some of that work that I did with a young woman in the shelter and took the transcripts from those interviews and translated them into movement with a group of dancers in Cincinnati who then performed the experience, the lived experience of those Black women, those intergenerational group of Black women on the streets in Cincinnati, and then literally gathered hundreds of people, Black, white, young, old, to follow them and be a part of this movement. So what does it mean to take up a gesture or a dance or a way of being in space that is not necessarily your own, but then becomes your own? What does it mean to live through someone else's experience through your body, even if you don't know that's what's happening, you know, in the moment? And so I'm just so excited about this conversation and your project because it raises so many questions, and I really see you as, I just imagine like Catherine Dunham watching over you and so excited about how you're expanding the way that you think about protection and preservation. My God, you know what I mean? Like the way she was cataloging movement in Haiti and in Trinidad and Martinique, and what you're doing with the Black Movement Project, I think she would be so delighted to see how you're thinking about movement in the way that we can not just document, but what then can we do with that documentation? There's so many possibilities. So thank you for your work.
So I guess we'll go into just like just having a conversation. Okay.
Natural.
Transition. Yes. So the questions that that sort of brought this here. The first one is, what does it mean to ethically digitize Black movement? And the reason why I ask this question is mainly because I've been working with motion capture and motion capture data for a while now, and the technologies themselves, they kind of like raise a lot of questions with how they're actually recording the movements, as well as the process of cleaning it after. So in motion capture, you go through this process of capturing the movements. You go through a process of calibrating the space or calibrating the people in the suits. And basically that just allows for you to capture the movements as clean as possible. But then there's this whole process of cleaning the data afterwards in another program. And so I've been thinking about how sometimes cleaning data can sometimes take away from what happened. I'm wondering if it's good to keep the data that isn't cleaned to sort of show the bridge or the relationship between the dancer and the technology itself, as well as the cleaned version. But then I'm also thinking about who is cleaning the data as well. I mean, normally right now it's me, but what does it mean for someone to clean the data and not actually know? Like you'll watch like a reference video for what happened, but if you don't actually know the person or know like what movements that they would actually do, like what does it mean for that person to sort of have this agency over what they think the movements should be?
Can I ask a question? This is just my ignorance. What does cleaning it mean? Like what would happen from the original to the clean version?
So sometimes there are breaks in the movements. So sometimes it'll be, somebody will do like a movement of like raising their arm, but sometimes there's like an arm break and like the arm goes through like the digital body. And because digital bodies don't have like this sort of like physical space, it sort of allows for all of these like wacky things to happen. And so if someone was supposed to do this, but the data did this instead, what does it mean for someone to then go back in and then do that?
Okay.
And how does that change the intention of the movement? Or how does that change the movement?
I mean, for me, it reminds me of other forms of capturing movement and data, like it goes back to photography and film. There's no way that you can actually replicate real life onto any other format in a way that is objective and universal truth. There's always going to be some kind of interpretation. And that totally works in this case as well when you're cleaning it up, because it's about who the intention of the person and the knowledge of the person who's taking the data and making it into something presentable or framing it in the way, like, it all goes into like what they want to use it for and what their intention is, and then taking it and presenting it into another space. So like with photography, for example, famously, you couldn't really find film that could properly capture black skin until the 70s and 80s. Because there was just nobody behind the technology that was actually that thought that was important. And this is a medium that from the beginning sold itself as this perfect encapsulation of life. Like it, got rid of painting for some, right? Like they're like, this is like, you're replicating life, but you're not. Like there's so many steps that it's going through to get to the final print of the photo. And I think that for me, I think motion capture has a lot of analogs with, right? Basically.
Yeah.
Like I don't think there's any perfect way to do it, right? But I don't think there needs to be, because it's always going to be interpreted by the person capturing it.
Yeah.
So it's more about the intention of the person who's actually putting the work in to turn what can be raw data that might not be useful on its own into like something that is meant to represent the original movement.
Yeah. I mean, it just raises a lot of questions for me around when we're thinking about black bodies and blackness and legibility, and the ways that, when we talk about blackness, we're often talking about excess, something that is in excess of like the default, right, or the standard version. And what does that cleaning process do? And what does it mean to kind of keep, even in a sense of technology where the cleaning process is cleaning up the ways that we can't read, the ways that we can't read this simple movement. And so it becomes a matter of like illegibility in terms of the game, right, or in terms of the gesture, but it just raises all sorts of questions for me around like these larger issues with legibility. Who are we making bodies and experiences legible, you know, to and for whom, and what does that mean, this process of cleaning up or professionalizing, or you know, all the ways that we use this language to talk about managing bodies, and I think it has a particular resonance when we're, you know, talking about Black movement, right, and what the excess of Black movement, right, or the parts that we're never really capturing real life, yet still there's a way that Black movement is being made legible as a commodity, right, and you gave that brilliant example of this isn't hip hop, right? When does it not matter that the movement isn't accurate, right? Isn't necessarily reflecting real life, and when is it essential that it does that as a way to accrue capital in various ways? And I just think, yeah, I think the question is a really fascinating one that crosses both, you know, the motion capture world and also the ways that we think about value and legibility and capital in everyday life. Yeah.
I guess that brings me to my next question about what fieldwork would look like using these digital tools. Mainly because I'm interested in working with multiple people at once. But what does it mean to sort of capture stories all together? And like, what is your process for like doing it, I mean, without these tools? And yeah, like how do you go through the process of?
This is my question for you. Like, how do we use these tools to think about field work? I mean, so if you're talking about field work in the sense of the Cincinnati example with using the translation from lived experience and words to movement, or just in general going into a space and trying to understand what's happening in that particular location through capturing it through the body. So I'll just start with the Cincinnati example. So in that example, without these brilliant tools, what happened there is that those audio transcripts of the interviews, we just listened to them over and over again, almost like a meditation. Like we would turn the lights off and we would be like on our backs on the floor, just taking in these words of the women. And what I then asked the dancers to do, and some of the dancers were the actual women who had recorded the interviews, was to not try to overthink it, but just let their bodies respond to what they were hearing. And then I asked them to create movement based on that experience of listening to those stories. And so from that translation, from hearing these stories, you know, first having the interview process, recording the interviews, and then having the movers listen to those interviews and then take on and digest and integrate those stories and then embody them, we created kind of a toolkit of movement gestures. So each dancer had a series of movement gestures based on their response to those interviews. And then we created kind of a collective, collaborative, I guess steps, you could say, or gestures based on the whole group thinking about what those interviews meant in their bodies. And then we kind of distilled it, and I guess you could call this maybe our own cleaning process. We distilled it to like very simple, a set of 4 essential gestures that came from that whole messy process, right? So as I'm talking about this, I guess I did the same thing with the cleaning, right? We sort of, and the reason for that was because the performance was going to take place in public space and we wanted people to join in and be a part of it. And we didn't want complex choreography where people would feel like they couldn't join in. So we had to think about like, how do we then translate this very nuanced, complicated experience of being a Black woman in a city like Cincinnati, Ohio, into gestures that we could get people to both feel comfortable taking on, but still kept some sort of the essence of the experience. And in that particular ethnographic moment, that's what the process was for thinking about the connection between movement and bodies and translation and creating the gestures. And so the technology there was very much just the audio of the interviews, and then the rest of it was the bodily technologies of the body, and body-to-body translation.
So if you had the opportunity to build, build a space in a digital environment, what would that reflect? Like, would it look like the environments that you taught them in? Or would it look more like a stage?
I want you to tell me that. Like, this is like the question I have for you. I don't know, like, and this technology is so new to me, and I'm wondering, and this is a sincere question, like, what is the possibility? What do you see as a possibility? Because you've also done some, ethnographic work and fieldwork. Like, given that example, how do you see the potential for this technology to be a part of that, or to expand it, or totally blow it up and disrupt it? I'm not sure.
True. So I guess, like, for me, in a lot of my work is sort of aesthetically wise, it sort of explores outside of reality and what is real. So a lot of the places that I built in 3D don't exist anywhere else. And what I love about that is that it allows me to sort of do whatever I want. And what I also love about gaming engines too is that there's opportunities to sort of like play with the different parameters of physics. So I like to, fuck up the physics a lot of a space. And I like to play with just all of the different boundaries and how I can essentially push them. Almost most of the time to the breaking point. I just want to see what I can do. I want to see, I want to explore like the boundaries of what these tools are, and how much I can like sort of place my imagination into those spaces. So yeah, I guess for the worlds that I built for Ronaldo and Nala, what I was thinking of aesthetically was sort of creating a space. Like I had created relationships with them. I built relationships with them, and outside of just the interviews. So in learning about them and learning about just how they move, learning about their journeys as movers, that allowed me to work with certain colors, to sort of work with certain parameters that I think would fit for their particular worlds. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, it's just hearing both of your stories. There's so much overlap in terms of, it's almost like what you're doing is almost an answer to her question in the idea that how do you take a movement that becomes divorced of its origin and still stay true to that movement? Once it goes into the internet and on a library that may not be moored to reality anymore, or to like real life. That is happening when you record somebody's voice and then take it into another context and have someone interpret that. But it's all happening with everyone, in every step of the way. People are still connected to the original source. And in your art, like, yeah, you're not copying one scene to another. You're taking the original dancers and their stories and their the emotion they're trying to convey and how their emotion plays out, or how you observe it, and then abstracting it and trying to find this emotional undertone and this presentation that is true to it while not being a realistic depiction at all. Like, it's completely abstract and more of a kind of a emotional picture of what they're doing versus just trying to catalog it. So in that way, I think it shows that you don't necessarily have to, like, while it is vital to keep the original stories alive and the original and the credit to the person who's performing the dances and all of that which you're doing, it's also, I think there's a lot of potential to transform it and to translate it and see where that goes, and see what kind of new experiences that opens up when you can then you can take these motions, abstract them, and see what somebody else might want to do with them. That's really exciting, and that's something that's cool with the internet. Is like anybody can then download it and incorporate it into their art, which is like really cool.
So with your work with Ronaldo and Nala, you were actually able to create an imaginary world, or you created worlds based on the stories that they told you?
Yes.
So I guess, in answer to your question about what would it look like in terms of space, I mean, these women were imagining a different relationship to Cincinnati. And so the ways that they could sort of enact that was through their bodies, taking on different motions through space. But what would it look like to partner with you and think about how these imaginary worlds or this alternative way of imagining the city become to life digitally? So they're not just, bodies in space and accumulating the energetic, like visceral movement through space, but what would it mean to actually physically interact with the digital world that was bringing to life that possible geography or a new possible geography? Is that possible?
Anything is possible. Anything is possible. Yeah. For my next question, I sort of want to focus a little bit more on data and protecting the data. And if you could speak a little bit more about your research on exactly what happened with Fortnite and
Sure. So Fortnite was an interesting case because I guess it was around last year when a bunch of artists pursued lawsuits against Epic, who was the developer that made the game, because they were taking these dances, changing their names, but keeping the exact movements, and then selling them for money and making literally billions. So you had artists, I think, McMillian and a few others, Alfonso Ribeiro, because his Carlton dance got copied. So there was definitely multiple lawsuits that were pursued. The problem is that it's very difficult to copyright choreography, and especially gestures and movements that are not considered part of a complete dance. If it's just one movement, it becomes incredibly hard to do that, and even that itself is this incredibly unfair and oppressive system where you see copyright law, which can be incredibly punitive in other areas. Like if you ever try and put music on YouTube, you see how that goes. But when it comes to protecting Black dance and other forms of art, it's actually incredibly weak and hard to pursue. And also, it's up to you, the individual, to pursue the enforcement of it. So I don't think most of the lawsuits didn't really take hold. But when I was coming into writing the piece, it was actually after a lot of this, and a lot of the discussion at the time was just focused on the feasibility of the lawsuit. Can they do it, or did Carlton really come up with that dance? Which I would argue he did. But for me, it was more the ethical concerns, and also how it fits into history. It's just a pattern that we've seen, throughout American history and a lot of the history of the world, where a lot of art and movement comes from marginalized people who have no stake in the mainstream. The mainstream then comes, appropriates it, repackages it, recontextualizes it, and then sells it to a totally different audience as something that isn't what it is. And so I think that was totally happening in Fortnite. It's what happened with jazz and rock and roll and singing and dance and throughout history. In the article I talk about things like American Bandstand, which was this huge institution that would have people dancing every weekend throughout for decades, and for a lot of its history didn't allow Black dancers on, but then it would have all these white dancers who just would go to Harlem or go hang out with in other spaces, learn the dance, bring it to American Bandstand, and then present it as if it's completely a invention of their own. they came up with in a vacuum. So I think that history really speaks for itself and draws such strong connections. So I just had to write about it. And yeah, I think it is this. It's tough because it shows you. I mean, it's really just power and the imbalance of the power writ in this really obvious way. But power is hard to challenge on that level, and especially when the laws that are meant to protect you aren't really effective. And I think that is also why I think your project is great, and also indicative of your intention in the project, because right away, like you kind of saw this happening, and you were on another trajectory, which was more about representation and of being like, how do I represent forms of movement and cultures that are just not there, just not in the spaces that I was trained to use. But then immediately you're also like, actually, but it's not just representation. It's also honesty and transparency and being true to the artist that I'm bringing into the spotlight, because it's so easy to just bring up representation and kind of put people into the limelight, and they can be exploited because they don't have protections. And it happens with hip hop. You have all these artists who get a quick 10 seconds of fame. Their dances, their likeliness is taken and monetized by somebody who's not them, and then they may go away. They're and gone. So because they don't necessarily have somebody in their corner that's trying to protect them and trying to protect the story that they may be trying to tell. So I think it's indicative of your project that you're already thinking about this, in addition to wanting to simply open up the space to people who are not traditionally represented. Yeah, let me know if I didn't cover something, but.
No. Yeah, no, that was great. So, how would you go about challenging tools in the sense that that are hard to use because they aren't built for you? Do you think that it's helpful to talk with these tool makers and have discussions with them, or do you think that it's just better to, just sort of like talk about it amongst, your own collective of people and then build out new tools that way? The thing about that is that it'll take a lot longer to build out your own tools, but how, would you see, creating the groundwork for creating tools that effectively show and represent different bodies?
We talked about this a little bit, and in terms of, I think where we came to was this idea of making some kind of manifesto, this this statement of purpose that people who are inclined to listen and inclined to change their process would take into account. And I think that's a really powerful potential direction. But I also think, I think there's a lot of merit in not necessarily waiting for people who don't have a stake in changing to change. A lot of what you can do can happen more on a grassroots level and more in your own work and your own process. And there's definitely going to be limitations because the tools are limited, they are, and they have certain bodies and certain types of people in mind when they design them because of who's designing them. So I think it could be, you know, like a two-pronged thing, like where I think there will be people in the software space who are currently there who are open to changing their process and to incorporating other voices, but also due to the nature of like people can only, you know, a lot of times it's hard for people to think outside of their own experience, and when you have software, which is such a hegemonically, you know, white and wealthy space, that becomes a barrier to change, because it's kind of like, you know, you're knocking against a big wall that might not hear you, and that's a frustrating thing when you're working in software, because software is hard to make, and you don't want to waste all your time like starting from scratch. Like you don't want to like have to trek off in your own direction entirely. I think that for me, I think it's more about figuring out the process, like figuring out like what you can do now, right? What you can do with the tools that you have, and at the same time, totally reach out to these hardware manufacturers and software people, like, because it sounds like you're doing a little bit of that already. Are you getting into that process of like reaching out to people? And I think that's great. I think like just see who wants to listen, because like if I was proud of my tools, I would want to know that they were capable of capturing more than like the default, or more than like, you know, one linear area, and writing about it, and like kind of that's what I do. It's like I just yell into the void and hope that somebody listens. Like,
and I just wonder how much incentive there is to change if it's not attached to capital. And I think that if it is, I mean, we see the same thing in the arts. We see the same sort of shifts that happen in film when it's attached to a consuming public, when there's the incentive of profit. And I think that we'll see those changes that you're talking about. But in the meantime, you know, not to be pessimistic, but it just, the mission, you kept saying tools, and I kept thinking of master's tools. And you know, exactly, you know, how possible is it really? And the work that you're doing is already so transformative. And maybe it calls for even a reconfiguration of what the tool is, or the reach of it, and what does it mean to kind of have, I know we're talking about the digitizing and kind of even sort of a cyberspace that's meant to be accessible, widely accessible, but what does it mean to even think in sort of smaller scale, and starting smaller and thinking about ways that the work that you're doing and the work to disrupt, you know, the default happens in a smaller scale and then builds from there. But I don't know this world as much as well as the two of you, but it just strikes me that I don't see any real change happening if it's not. We saw the change. I mean, that you said it yourself with the hip hop image. Yes, you can, if there's a dollar sign attached to it. Yes, we can really figure out what these movements accurately look like when there's some profit to be made. So I just wonder how much incentive there is to make those changes if there's not, you know, if it can't be commodified, or if there's not a benefit beyond, if the benefit doesn't include capital gain.
yeah, I feel like I just think there's so much you can do that you already have done, like with the hardware at hand, like that then will, you know, you get that out there into more people's hands, like even just like bringing motion capture hardware to places to people who've never seen it, you know, who don't know what it is, what it does, like, and then helping them capture their movements into digital space. For me, that is very transformative, and that is very powerful. And then this kind of like making inroads, right? And making examples that then can come back elsewhere. Like it's happening in Hollywood in terms of cinematography. Like Moonlight came out, and Insecure, where they're like, oh, this is how you light black skin? Oh, wait a minute. Like, I knew that. No, like, it's like they totally, like, they had to do it. You know, I mean, these are big productions, but that school of thought has been there for a while and is, you know, but is now, like, at this critical mass. But they're working with limited tools and kind of figuring out their own methodology that actually ended up changing all of Hollywood, you know, like, so now it's like an embarrassment to like, in the way that's been happening for the past few decades. And it's still happening, but, you know, I think the conversation has changed. And I think that is probably the best thing you can do.
How long do we open it up to?
There's gotta be some questions in the room.
Yeah, so let's open it up to questions.
Hi, I just want to say thank y'all. You're really brilliant, and I'm really happy to be here and just learning from y'all. I'm actually like a writer, like less of a visual artist, and so the things that you were talking about, sort of cleaning up movements, it made me think a lot about like sort of the process of, I mean, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, like through the interview, like transcription and like sort of cleaning up language, you know, and like the politics of that. And so I'm just wondering like how y'all find those to be similar or different from each other, because we so often think of language as maybe the most political or sort of the most tied to power, as and maybe like we kind of overlook movement in that way. And so like what are the ethics that we need to deploy when we are, you know, taking people's words and making them more legible to certain folks, because legibility or readability is a thing, but also like you sort of can become colonial and change people's voices and take away that authenticity, right? So I'm thinking about that overlap, excuse me, and I would love to hear you guys sort of piece that out, and like where does that fall, and how do you find those ethics coming together, maybe being divergent because of the movement versus language thing?
That's a brilliant first question. Thank you for that question. It's a really brilliant question, and you know, thinking about when we try to capture something and name it as Black, automatically what that does to a thing, you know, whether it's movement or language or a style, like just naming it as Black, already we're saying something about what Blackness can or can't be, even if we don't mean to. And your question about language, I'll just tell you a little story. I have a graduate student who is doing work in Detroit, and brilliant student, young white man who's doing work in Detroit, and was reading an excerpt of his fieldwork notes to a seminar class where he was struggling with how to represent the language of folks in Detroit, and kept in the organic vernacular language, and the feedback he got was really harsh. And so I bring up that example to also think about who is authorizing, who's doing the cleaning up, who's doing the representation, because even in my own fieldwork in Detroit, I had to think a lot about, like, do I represent exactly word for word as people are speaking? And what I realized when I was thinking about this, like, am I creating caricatures? Do you know what I mean? Like, am I recreating stereotypes? But then why am I cleaning up people's language? And then I realized, like, when I went back to the transcripts, my own language, I didn't have an issue. I wasn't trying to clean up my own language. You know what I mean? Like, there was a way that I wasn't even objectively listening to how I speak in those moments, and how you know what I mean? Like, I was automatically just giving myself the cleaned up version. You know, not even like intentionally. And so I guess I don't know that I'm really answering your question. What I do need to say to you is I think it's a brilliant question, and it's one for us to think about, you know, authorship in terms of these ideas of cleaning or making legible. What do we lose in legibility? What do we gain from the messiness of not being coherent? You know, when we think about Black culture or Blackness or Black bodies, and then what becomes even more inaccessible to us when we're not legible? I mean, there's just so many things to think about, but I love the way that you brought language as an example into this. It's really, I think it's hard. I don't know that I have the answer, but I just wanted to give you that example of, it's really tricky, and it raises other questions around who's doing it. We talked a lot about intention before we came out here, intentionality, and does it matter? And then ultimately, once that thing is out in the world, you don't have a hold of it anymore. With even the best intentions, with even the most ethical ways of cleaning or not cleaning, once it's out in the world, each person who's encountering that gesture, that movement, or that language, or that sentence is going to take it up in a certain way. But I just think it's a brilliant question, and thank you.
You know, I was just struck by the thought of like auto transcription services, and like I wonder like how they're warping language. You know, this is it. Like, you know, what language are they being tuned to when they're designed, and like what is then like, and that's just going to keep happening going forward. You know.
Hello. Oh, good. Okay. Sorry. Question for you. First, like, I really appreciate the subject matter. I've been following your work, and it's been really beautiful to see. I'm curious about the things that you say or demonstrate or communicate when you're trying to establish trust with a community that are giving data that have traditionally had in history like a very contentious relationship with providing that data. So how do you establish trust with the community that you're working with?
So the people who are contributing to the library, or
because historically, Black bodies and like the utilization of data has not always, though the intention has been good, not always gone in a very productive way. And I guess like I'm wondering like how do you communicate in a way that results in like trust with the community that you're working with?
So for the first performance and the first two performers that I worked with, essentially I built the relationship by first just having a phone conversation with them to sort of see what they felt about their journeys as movers. One of the things that I'm very passionate about is making sure that performers get compensated for their work. That's another way. So there will not be a performance if the performers aren't getting paid. And I mean, so right now, I mean, like I don't have that much money, but like, I make sure that if there's a performance happening, those performers are compensated, and I make sure that I am just communicating to them and letting them know that I actually care. Mainly because, you know, I also come from a performance background, which is not, you know, the same, it's different, but I guess like this is also just like how I communicate with most people though. I try to make sure that that everyone is in a space and that they feel heard in that space. And I guess like that's also like the purpose of the performances. Also, basically creating a space for them and for both of us to not just like have them come into a motion capture studio and I just take their movements and I say go, like bye, but also to have an opportunity for them to really showcase who they are, or who they want to show within those performances themselves. So that's one way. Within the workshops, when people come in, I try to teach in a way where I'm not so focused on people you know, knowing the tools right away. I think that one of my problems with, I guess, traditional tech workshops is that sometimes you'll have a teacher who sort of just breezes through all the tools and just like throws code in your face and they're like, look at all this code, and you're just like, I don't know what's happening. and it's sort of like this feedback loop that ultimately makes you feel intimidated, makes you feel like you don't even want to, you know, work with these tools anymore. So for me, it's really important that when I show the tools, I'm like, listen, nobody knows like the fullness of this tool. Like this tool can be used for many different things. Just like, let's work together. Let's not get intimidated by this space because I need you to be here. I need more rogue voices, more different, like just a load of different people working with the tools. Mainly because even when it comes to building these projects, when you go to like get a team of developers and you know, people who are like doing motion capture and all of that, I really want the project and everyone who's working on that project to reflect what the project is about, which is something that I've realized and I've seen hasn't been the case, you know? Like, you'll see a project that is about blackness, and then you'll look at, you know, the team, and you'll be like, how is this about blackness? And the team is not black. So it's like, you know, what does it mean? Like, how do you like sort of open the doors, and how can I teach in a way where people are like, okay, well maybe I'll come back and I'll learn this over time, and I don't need to know all this in one day or in 1 week, but I can learn over the process. So I don't know if that answered.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Hi. So I'm thinking about how the archive is something that can serve us rather than disenfranchise us, but I'm also thinking about how anytime we put our history, our work, our archives as Black people out into the white world, it's easily poisoned or co-opted by white supremacy and capitalism. And so I'm wondering, how are you all thinking about your navigating the accessibility of your work, and have you considered not making this available to white people, or otherwise like taking your work underground to other Black channels?
Yeah, so I definitely thought about that. I guess, like that's, so just to make clear, you know, I'm not gonna put or publish anyone's movements without actually having in place the correct, I guess, licensing or membership type thing to make sure that, you know, because the number one thing for me is that I'm making sure that I'm protecting dancers and not exploiting them. So that's been the large journey for me, and to find that answer is pretty much why I sort of opened the space to be more community-based, to hold these types of events, to sort of figure out the answer to this question, mainly because it's like, well, do I protect this using the law when there's no laws to protect us, you know? But that's also sort of the point of America. So it's like, you know, what do you do? So it's like, I've been, and I guess that's also why I've been focusing more on the workshops rather than just the library, just the motion capture library itself, because I think it's more helpful right now, at least, to teach people how to use tools that are available rather than just giving them resources and just saying like, here you go. Because you know, there are motion capture libraries out, even though they're not like representative of the movements that I want to use. I also am aware that the community of people who are looking for motion capture libraries is not reflective of who I want to use those movements. So it's like, first you have to build the space, you have to build the community of people who would actually use these movements, and then you can introduce a library and say, here's a library, here's a set of tools that you can use to be able to build what you're trying to build.
Yeah, just to add, yeah, I think the process of reaching out to people and doing the workshops is really so important here. Like, it couldn't function without it, because not just bringing people up to be served to the slaughter, metaphorically. Like, you are also showing people that these are things that they can do and tools that they can use to make their own art, like, and also to see their dance as, and their movements as something with value and something that has reach and that can communicate things and like tell stories. Like that's such an important part of the library as well. It's not just like, because like motion capture libraries now are literally just like, I need to animate this thing really quick, I don't care, just, you know, throw it down there and onto this like generic skeleton, and my job is done, which is like such a limiting way to look at movement and bodies and humanity. So like, yeah, of course, you're not going to like I don't think it's a good idea to replicate those systems, which I don't think you want to do, but like it's good to know what, you know, what is out there and what not to do, and what like and what are the reasons for it being limited now? Because like the reasons is the lack of thought and the thoughtlessness and the capitalistic aspect of it, and how it fits into an exploitative system most of the time. So I think you kind of have a lot of examples of what to avoid. So like you're starting in a good spot.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm also thinking about how to sort of humanize these digital tools as well, or what does it look like to humanize this space? Mainly because, you know, even with the example with Fortnite, you know, there was someone who got paid to go to the motion capture studio to do the Millie Rock, you know, but we don't know who that is, and then that one person's Millie Rock is now able to drive so many people's avatars that they create within Fortnite, and I'm wondering about, you know, how do I figure out who that person is, and also if they're getting compensated every time someone downloads that dance, and what the model is. So it's like, you know, I guess I'm thinking about what the model would be for someone to potentially download the movements, and also what it would mean if, let's say, I guess, Fortnite, if I were to allow Fortnite, what rules and regulations would I have to put in place to make sure that they are properly compensating and also properly citing where those movements came from.
And not to keep going on this, but I think it's a really interesting subject, because like game studios in particular are incredibly exploitative places, because they hide the labor that goes into the production. Like that by design. It's like you don't hear about any of the developers who work in this game. Like, you know, people who animated it, who like cleaned it up, who put the person and put the colors on the character and the costumes. Like all those hundreds of jobs are just like, you know, they don't matter to the people playing the game or to anyone. So like this is the system that then, you know, Black movement is being absorbed into. It already has the template to erase labor and to erase like art, and then to kind of package it into something else. Like, you know, so it's kind of fitting a pre-existing formula.
Hi, so I'm also an extended reality developer, and so the perspective I'm coming at this from is all the talk about accuracy in data is relative to kind of resolution, like how high fidelity the resolution of the experience is. And I know from my work that like immersion means that fidelity needs to be endlessly high, right? And I guess I don't know if I have a question, but more just an observation that like you guys have the double duty of both explaining American culture and the history of the perspective of the black body being viewed by others, and also forging new territory in this immersive world. And I can't fathom how difficult it must be to have to serve two different very important purposes in that space. And I would just say that like I think making the tools accessible and exposing people to what these can do, no matter their skill level, is like so commendable. But I guess if you're looking at this from like a New Horizon perspective, like how do you forge new pathways and create an experience or an immersion that could help us all embody what a better world would look like? Like, how do you see your tool fitting into that? Is that possible? Do you think that's possible?
I don't know. I mean, no. Okay, so what I'm hoping for, though, and which is why I guess I'm mainly using the term library, because, and actually now I'm like sort of developing this as like an idea of like this, like what would a library of the future look like? And you know, how would people engage with that space? So for me, I think that like I used to work for a STEAM program at Macon Library, and we would go into the basement and we'd like set up like all these tools and you know teach kids from the community. And in that sense, like when I think about this sort of like direct help for the community there, as opposed to, I guess, like I wasn't saving, you know, all of Bed-Stuy. I wasn't saving all of Bed-Stuy, but I mean, I was spending time with, you know, the kids while they were there in that moment, and I don't know if, like, I'm not sure how, and I guess this also like goes for a lot of different nonprofits of like how do you measure like the success of what it is you're actually doing. I feel like a lot of nonprofits, I mean, a lot of nonprofits, they sort of like wrongly suggest that they're providing more value than they actually are. And I mean, it sucks because it's like, you know, for me, like working in the nonprofit space for such a long time, at first I thought I was doing so much work. I was like, oh, look at me. But then I realized, you know, staying there for such a long amount of time that there was so much more that could be done, and that there were just so many barriers that were placed unfairly in a lot of ways, but also, I guess, you know, nonprofit industrial complex type stuff. But so I guess in that way, it's like how do you transform even what the nonprofit space looks like, on top of what does it mean to look at the future of the library? And if it cannot work in either of those spaces, then what is this? Oh, but then that brings me to my last slide. Hold on. No. The Black Movement Project is a movement. So, yes. You know, like, if it's not a library, if it's not a nonprofit, if it's not just like a tool, then really what we're trying to do is create a movement just to have people, to bring people aware of, you know, all of the problems in this space, but also to bring people aware of, you know, this idea that Black movement holds so much more than just the visual movement itself. You know, like the fact that we are still moving is so inspirational. Like after everything in history, the fact that we still move, the fact that we still pass down these movements through like barbecues and cookouts and house parties, and the fact that we are still moving is so inspirational to me, and that's really what I want to talk about. That's what I want to categorize, and I don't know if that's going to save the world, but it's going to do something. So yeah.
I'm just so glad that you brought up library and movement, because I think it responds to the question of archive as well as your last question. I think what you're doing, that is part of what is so powerful about what you're doing, is that you're holding us all accountable. So this ongoing conversation about the archive is the fundamental conversation in Black studies right now, in Black life. We are erased from the archive. How do we show up? Do we insert ourselves? Do we create our own archives? And I think you're giving us a new model for even envisioning what an archive can be. An archive as a sort of stagnant space where we're depositing information is not what a Black archive could ever be. A Black archive must be about community, it must be about the collective, it must be about constant movement and change, and that's exactly what your project is doing. And in that sense, it's not additional labor, you're accountable, right? If you're a part of this library, if you're accessing this information, it's not on LaJuné or Black, cyber workers to share this information or transform the space. We all have to transform the space. And I think that language and the way that you're envisioning the archive beyond the depository, or how do we become a part of it or expand it, but like completely transforming the way that we think about documenting and preserving as an action, right? Not as a final, like a noun, the archive, but the archive as a moving, living, breathing action, right? That holds us all accountable. And that is for me, like the most fundamental power of your project. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, LaJuné. So there's a Yoruba proverb, it's hard to dance in a borrowed rap. America has always been a messed up place. The foundation is cracked. The walls are tilted. The shelf sits proud of the cabinet. But one thing I love about your work is the grace that you move, even with this borrowed wrap that you're forced to wear. And you mentioned American Bandstand, but that show came out of a particular social context. Before the drug epidemics, before the crime waves, before deindustrialization, before kind of this CIA systematic dismantling of the Black community. And what I feel so humbled to be in the presence of by your project is how you're using this digital space, which is used to create a false sense of participation, to create actual participation. And I was wondering if you could speak a little more about that, about how you're inviting community into work, how through light and movement, something new is formed.
Wow. I guess, like going back to just starting my time here at Eyebeam, I really honestly didn't foresee it evolving into this large project in space. And I think that at the beginning, I didn't really know how to do that. So I've been doing a lot of learning how to go into different spaces, and what that means to and what it means to, I guess, translate the things that I'm trying to say in many different ways. So I guess like, how can I say something in a way that everyone can sort of take something from it? For me, I guess like in the beginning, you know, I've just been, you know, sort of like lonely. And I was talking to you a little bit about this earlier, but just like that loneliness of having to be in this space, and sort of in feeling like, you know, what I'm doing, I'm sort of doing by myself. What does it mean to sort of like open that space and allow for not being lonely? So yeah, I don't know, like I have to like process this question. But yeah, I mean, I guess I want to feel like I'm at home. And I don't want to feel like I have to constantly censor myself, and I want to produce a space that allows for other people to feel that way as well. Because I feel like there are so many times where I'm walking throughout space and I feel like I have to put on another performance of, you know, this sort of like additional, oh, and that's another thing, yeah. So for me, walking through a lot of spaces as a dark-skinned femme has just been very difficult. So what are the different ways that I have to perform? And that's, you know, in itself, even though it's a very like censored form of Black movement, it still is Black movement in a way. And so I guess I'm just trying to be like a freer version of myself, and that requires me building out the spaces to be able to do that. And in order to build those spaces out, I can't do it alone. So knowing how to ask and reach out for help has been something that I've been learning how to do. And yeah.